Section 2. The Religion of Small Property. We hear a great deal nowadays about the disadvantages of decorum, especially from those who are always telling us that women in the last generation were helpless and impotent, and then proceeding to prove it by describing the tremendous and towering tyranny of Mrs. Grundy. Rather, in the same way, they insist that Victorian women were especially soft and submissive. And it is rather unfortunate for them that even in order to say so, they have to introduce the name of Queen Victoria. But it is more especially in connection with the indecorous in art and literature that the question arises, and it is now the fashion to argue as if there were no psychological basis for reticence at all. That is where the argument should end. But fortunately, these thinkers do not know how to get to the end of an argument. I have heard it argued that there is no more harm in describing the violation of one commandment than of another, but this is obviously a fallacy. There is, at least, a case in psychology for saying that certain images move the imagination to the weakening of the character. There is no case for saying that the mere contemplation of a kit of burglars' tools would inflame us all with a desire to break into houses. There is no possibility of pretending that the mere sight of means to murder our maiden aunt with a poker does really make the ill deed done. But what strikes me as most curious about the controversy is this, that while our fiction and journalism is largely breaking down the prohibitions for which there really was a logical case, in the consideration of human nature, they still very largely feel the pressure of prohibitions for which there was never any case at all. And the most curious thing about the criticism we hear directed against the Victorian age is that it is never directed against the most arbitrary conventions of that age. One of these, which I remember very vividly in my youth, was the convention that there is something embarrassing or unfair about a man mentioning his religion. There was something of the same feeling about his mentioning his money. Now these things cannot possibly be defended by the same psychological argument as the other. Nobody is moved to madness by the mere sight of a church spire, or finds uncontrollable emotions possess him at the thought of an archdeacon's hat. Yet there is still enough of that really irrational Victorian convention lingering in our life and literature to make it necessary to offer a defence, if not an apology, whenever an argument depends upon this fundamental fact in life. Now, when I remark that we want a type of colonization rather represented by the French Canadians, there are probably still a number of sly critics who would point the finger of detection at me and cry, as if they had caught me in something very naughty, "You believe in the French Canadians because they are Catholics," which is, in one sense, not only true, but very nearly the whole truth. But in another sense it is not true at all, if it means that I exercise no independent judgment in perceiving that this is really what we do want. Now, when this difficulty and misunderstanding arises, there is only one practical way of meeting it in the present state of public information, or lack of information. It is to call what is generally described as an impartial witness, though it is quite probable that he is far less impartial than I am. What is really important about him is that if he were partial, he would be partial on the other side. The dear old Daily News of the days of my youth, on which I wrote happily for many years, and had so many good and admirable friends, cannot be accused as yet of being an organ of the Jesuits. It was, and is, as everyone knows, the organ of the nonconformists. Dr. Clifford brandished his teapot there when he was selling it in order to demonstrate, by one symbolical act, that he had long been a teetotaler and was now a passive resister. We may be pardoned for smiling at this aspect of the matter, but there are many other aspects which are real and worthy of all possible respect. The tradition of the old Puritan ideal does really descend to this paper, and multitudes of honest and hard-thinking radicals read it in my youth and read it still. I therefore think that the following remarks, which appeared recently in the Daily News, in an article by Mr. Hugh Martin, writing from Toronto, are rather remarkable. He begins by saying that the Anglo-Saxon has got too proud to bend his back, but the curious thing is that he goes on to suggest, almost in so many words, that the backs of the French Canadians are actually strengthened, not only by being bent over rustic spades, but even by being bent before superstitious altars. I am very anxious not to do my impartial witness an unfair damage in the matter, so I may be excused if I quote his own words at some little length. After saying that the Anglo-Saxons are drawn away to the United States, or at any rate to the industrial cities, he remarks that the French are, of course, very numerous in Quebec and elsewhere, but that it is not here that the notable development is taking place, and that Montreal, being a large city, is showing signs of the slackening to be seen in other large cities. Now, look at the other picture. The race that is going ahead is the French race. In Quebec, where there are nearly 2 million Canadians of French origin in a population of 2,350,000, that might have been expected. But as a matter of fact, it is not in Quebec that the French are making good most conspicuously. Nor in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick is the comparative success of the French stock most marked. They are doing splendidly on the land and raising prodigious families. A family of 12 is quite common, and I could name several cases where there have been 20, who all lived. The day may come when they will equal or outnumber the Scotch, but that is some way ahead. If you want to see what French stock can still achieve, you should go to the northern part of this province of Ontario. It is doing pioneer work. It is bending its back as men did in the old days. It is multiplying and staying on the soil. It is content to be happy without being rich. Though I am not a religious man myself, I must confess I think religion has a good deal to do with it. These French Canadians are more Catholic than the Pope. You might call a good many of them desperately ignorant and desperately superstitious. They seem to me to be a century behind the times, and a century nearer happiness. These seem to me, I repeat, to be rather remarkable words. Remarkable if they appeared anywhere, arresting and astonishing when they appear in the traditional paper of the Manchester Radicals in the 19th century Nonconformists. The words are splendidly straightforward and unaffected in their literary form. They have a clear ring of sincerity and experience, and they are all the more convincing because they are written by somebody who does not share my own desperate ignorance and desperate superstition. But he proceeds to suggest a reason, and incidentally to make his own independence in the matter quite clear. Apart from the fact that their women bear an incredible number of children, you have this other consequence of their submission to the priest, that a social organism is created which is of incalculable value in the backwoods. The church, the school, the cure, hold each little group together as a unit. Do not think for a moment that I believe a general spread of Catholicism would turn us back into a pioneer people. One might just as reasonably recommend a return to early Scottish Protestantism. I merely record the fact that the simplicity of these people is proving their salvation, and is one of the most hopeful things in Canada today. Of course, there are many good things of an incidental kind that a person with my views might comment on in that passage. I might go off at a gallop on the highly interesting comparison with early Scotch Protestantism. Very early Scotch Protestantism, like very early English Protestantism, consisted chiefly of loot. But if we take it as referring to the perfectly pure and sincere enthusiasm of many Covenanters or early Calvinists, we come upon the contrast that is the point of the whole matter. Early Puritanism was pure Puritanism, but the purer it is, the more early it seems. We cannot imagine it as a good thing and also a modern thing. It might have been one of the most honest things in Scotland then, but nobody would be found calling it one of the most hopeful things in Canada today. If John Knox appeared tomorrow in the pulpit of St. Giles, he would be a stick-it minister. He would be regarded as a raving savage because of his ignorance of German metaphysics. That comparison does not meet the extraordinary case of the thing that is older than Knox, and yet also newer than Knox. Or again, I might point out that the common connotation of submission to the priest is misleading, even if it is true. It is like talking of the charge of the Light Brigade is the submission to Lord Raglan. It is still more like talking about the storming of Jerusalem is the submission to the Count of Bouillon. In one sense, it is quite true. In another, it is very untrue. But I have not the smallest desire here to disturb the impartiality of my witness. I have not the smallest intention of using any of the torture of the Inquisition to make him admit anything that he did not wish to admit. The admission, as it stands, seems to me very remarkable, not so much because it is a tribute to Frenchmen as colonists, as because it is a tribute to colonists as pious and devout people. But what concerns me most of all in the general discussion of my own theme is the insistence on stability. They are staying on the soil. They are a social organism. They are held together as a unit. That is the new note which I think is needed in all talk of colonization before it can again be any part of the hope of the world. A recent description of the happy factory, as it exists in America, or will exist in Utopia, rose from height to height of ideality until it ended with a sort of hush, as of the ultimate opening of the heavens, and these words about the workman: "He turns out for his homeward journey like a member of the Stock Exchange." Any attempt to imagine humanity in its final perfection always has about it something faintly unreal, as being too good for this world. But the visionary light that breaks from the cloud in that last phrase accentuates clearly the contrast which is to be drawn between such a condition and that of the labour of common men. Adam left Eden as a gardener, but he will set out for his homeward journey like a member of the Stock Exchange. St. Joseph was a carpenter, but he will be raised again as a stockbroker. Giotto was a shepherd, for he was not yet worthy to be a stockbroker. Shakespeare was an actor, but he dreamed day and night of being a stockbroker. Burns was a ploughman, but if he sang at the plough, how much more appropriately he would have sung in the Stock Exchange. It is assumed in this kind of argument that all humanity has consciously or unconsciously hoped for this consummation, and that if men were not brokers, it was because they were not able to broke. But this remarkable passage in Sir Ernest Ben's exposition has another application besides the obvious one. A stockbroker, in one sense, really is a very poetical figure. In one sense, he is as poetical as Shakespeare, and his ideal poet, since he does give to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. He does deal, to a great extent, in what economists, in their poetical way, describe as imaginaries. When he exchanges 2,000 Patagonian pumpkins for 1,000 shares in Alaskan whale blubber, he does not demand the sensual satisfaction of eating the pumpkin, or need to behold the whale with the gross eye of the flesh. It is quite possible that there are no pumpkins, and if there is somewhere such a thing as a whale, it is very unlikely to obtrude itself upon the conversation in the Stock Exchange. Now, what is the matter with the financial world is that it is a great deal too full of imagination, in the sense of fiction. And when we react against it, we naturally, in the first place, react into realism. When the stockbroker homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and Sir Ernest Ben, we are disposed to insist that it is indeed he who has the darkness, and we who have the daylight. He has not only the darkness, but the dreams, and all the unreal leviathans and unearthly pumpkins pass before him like a mere scroll of symbols in the dreams of the Old Testament. But when the small proprietor grows pumpkins, they really are pumpkins, and sometimes quite a large pumpkin for quite a small proprietor. If he should ever have occasion to grow whales, which seems improbable, they would either be real whales, or they would be of no use to him. We naturally grow a little impatient under these conditions, when people who call themselves practical scoff at the small proprietor as if he were a minor poet. Nevertheless, there is another side to the case, and there is a sense in which the small proprietor had better be a minor poet, or at least a mystic. Nay, there is even a sort of queer paradoxical sense in which the stockbroker is a man of business. It is to that other side of small property, is exemplified in the French Canadians, and an article on them in the Daily News, that I devoted my last remarks. The really practical point in that highly interesting statement is that in this case being progressive is actually identified with being what is called static. In this case, by a strange paradox, a pioneer is really a settler. In this case, by a still stranger paradox, a settler is a person who really settles. It will be noted that the success of the experiment is actually founded on a certain power of striking root, which we might almost call rapid tradition, as others talk of rapid transit. And indeed, The ground under the pioneer's feet can only be made solid by being made sacred. It is only religion that can thus rapidly give a sort of accumulated power of culture and legend to something that is crude or incomplete. It sounds like a joke to say that baptizing a baby makes the baby venerable. It suggests the old joke of the baby with spectacles who died an enfeebled old dotard at 5. Yet it is profoundly true that something is added that is not only something to be venerated, but something partly to be venerated for its antiquity, that is, for the unfathomable depth of its humanity. In a sense, a new world can be baptized as a new baby is baptized, and become a part of an ancient order not merely on the map, but in the mind. Instead of crude people merely extending their crudity and calling that colonization, it would be possible for people to cultivate the soil as they cultivate the soul. But for this it is necessary to have a respect for the soil as well as for the soul, and even a reverence for it, as having some associations with holy things. But for that purpose we need some sense of carrying holy things with us, and taking them home with us, not merely the feeling that holiness may exist is a hope. In the most exalted phrase, we need a real presence. In the most popular phrase, we need something that is always on the spot. That is, we want something that is always on the spot, and not only beyond the horizon. The pioneer instinct is beginning to fail, as a well-known traveller recently complained, but I doubt whether he could tell us the reason. It is even possible that he will not understand it in one radiant burst of joyful comprehension if I tell him that I am all in favour of a wild goose chase, so long as he really believes that the wild goose is the bird of paradise, but that it is necessary to hunt it with the hounds of heaven. If it be barely possible that this does not seem quite clear to him, I will explain that the traveller must possess something as well as pursue something, or he will not even know what to pursue. It is not enough always to follow the gleam. It is necessary sometimes to rest in the glow, to feel something sacred in the glow of the campfire, as well as the gleam of the polar star. That same mysterious and to some divided voice, which alone tells that we have here no abiding city, is the only voice which within the limits of this world can build up cities that abide. As I said at the beginning of this section, it is futile to pretend that such a faith is not a fundamental of the true change. But its practical relation to the reconstruction of property is that, unless we understand this spirit, we cannot now relieve congestion with colonization. People will prefer the mere nomadism of the town to the mere nomadism of the wilderness. They will not tolerate immigration if it merely means being moved on by the politicians, as they have been moved on by the policemen. They will prefer bread and circuses to locusts and wild honey, so long as the forerunner does not know for what god he prepares the way. But even if we put aside for the moment the strictly spiritual ideas involved in the change, we must admit that there are secular ideals involved which must be positive and not merely comparative, like the ideal of progress. We are sometimes taunted with setting against all other utopias what is in truth the most impossible utopia, with describing a merry peasant who cannot exist except on the stage, with depending on a china shepherdess who never was seen except on the mantelpiece. If we are indeed presenting impossible portraits of an ideal humanity, we are not alone in that. Not only the socialists, but also the capitalists parade before us their imaginary and ideal figures, and the capitalists, if possible, more than the socialists. For once that we read of the last earthly paradise of Mr. Wells, where men and women move gracefully in simple garments and keep their tempers in a way in which we in this world sometimes find difficult, even when we are the authors of utopian novels. For once we see the ideal figure of that vision, we see 10 times a day the ideal figure of the commercial advertisers. We are told to be like this man, or to imitate an aggressive person pointing his finger at us in a very rude manner for one who regards himself as a pattern to the young. Yet it is entirely an ideal portrait. It is very unlikely, we are glad to say, that any of us will develop a chin or a finger of that obtrusive type. But we do not blame either the capitalist or the socialist for setting up a type, or talismanic figure to fix the imagination. We do not wonder at their presenting the perfect person for our admiration. We only wonder at the person they admire. And it is quite true that in our movement, as much as any other, there must be a certain amount of this romantic picture-making. Men have never done anything in the world without it, but ours is much more of a reality as well as a romance than the dreams of the other romantics. There cannot be a nation of millionaires, and there has never yet been a nation of utopian comrades, but there have been any number of nations of tolerably contented peasants. In this connection, however, the point is that if we do not directly demand the religion of small property, we must at least demand the poetry of small property. It is a thing about which it is definitely and even urgently practical to be poetical. And it is those who blame us for being poetical who do not really see the practical problem. For the practical problem is the goal. The pioneer notion has weakened like the progressive notion, and for the same reason. People could go on talking about progress so long as they were not merely thinking about progress. Progressives really had in their mind some notion of a purpose in progress, and even the most practical pioneer had some vague and shadowy idea of what he wanted. The progressives trusted the tendency of their time, because they did believe, or at least had believed, in a body of democratic doctrines which they supposed to be in the process of establishment. And the pioneers and empire builders were filled with hope and courage because, to do them justice, most of them did, at least in some dim way, believe that the flag they carried stood for law and liberty and a higher civilization. They were therefore in search of something, and not merely in search of searching. They subconsciously conceived an end of travel, and not endless travelling. They were not only breaking through a jungle, but building a city. They knew, more or less, the style of architecture in which it would be built, and they honestly believed it was the best style of architecture in the world. The spirit of adventure has failed, because it has been left to adventurers. Adventure for adventure's sake became like art for art's sake. Those who had lost all sense of aim lost all sense of art, and even of accident. The time has come in every department, but especially in our department, to make once again vivid and solid the aim of political progress, or colonial adventure. Even if we picture the goal of the pilgrimage as a sort of peasant paradise, it will be far more practical than setting out on a pilgrimage which has no goal. But it is yet more practical to insist that we do not want to insist only on what we are calling the qualities of a pioneer, that we do not want to describe merely the virtues that achieve adventures. We want men to think, not merely of a place which they would be interested to find, but of a place where they would be contented to stay. Those who wish merely to arouse again the social hopes of the 19th century must offer not an endless hope, but the hope of an end. Those who wish to continue the building of the old colonial idea must leave off telling us that the Church of Empire is founded entirely on the rolling stone. For it is a sin against the reason to tell men that to travel hopefully is better than to arrive, and when once they believe it, they travel hopefully no longer.